is Dr. Professor David Olson. His interests, for those few of you who may not know, are in the area of language development, literacy, cognition. Several recent publications deal with this, and a very recent, I assume forthcoming, text deals with some institutional dimensions.
Right there.
And that's yeah, very good. Yeah, very interesting indeed, for sure. I was a special interest in children's understanding of language as well as psychology of teaching. Now, paired with Professor Olson is Professor Newton Duarte, from a visiting scholar in sociology and equity studies in education from Brazil, from Sao Paulo, where he is a full professor, has published extensively in Portuguese, and a growing set of his research are now being translated or have been translated into English, and actually a forthcoming text will be on its way, dealing with Marxist approaches to lifelong learning, the everyday, and schooling that will be coming up from Cambridge University Press within the next year. Newton's most recent publications deal with individuality, concept of individuality, cultural historic theories of the formation of the individual. He has a specialization in Vygotsky and psychology and Marxist philosophy. So, the format for today's session will be an opening presentation. We didn't exactly flip for it, but we're going to start with Professor Olson, opening presentation. He's told me he'll be somewhat less than our allotted 20 minutes for his opening presentation. Then we'll pass it over to Professor Duarte, who will then make a presentation, and then Professor Olson will have a chance to respond. Professor Duarte will have a chance to respond, and then we will open it up. And of course, really, at any time that it seems suitable in a kind of dialogic form for a question to be raised, I encourage you to make yourself known to the speakers, and we'll see if they can't make room for you at a suitable moment in their presentation. But barring that, we'll open it up to the floor generally after a series of presentations. So join me in welcoming our debate and our two speakers.
Thank you very much, Peter. I must say this is a first. I think this is the first time a psychologist has actually broached the walls of the sociology department. And I come with some trepidation, and in fact I brought a few colleagues from my department so that if things get rough we can... Secondly, it's a pleasure to be in this discussion with Newton Duarte. We both see this as an opportunity to start a discourse, not really to end it. Although the topic, when it was first raised, was to be one of a debate about some more technical issues in Vygotsky and theories of knowledge and theories of learning, it was Newton's suggestion that we turn it more broadly into this issue about schooling, the nature, structure of schooling, because both of us are quite interested, I believe, and we'll hear Newton speak for himself, not only in advancing a particular argument, but in trying to frame the problem of what schooling is, how we should think about it, how we could profitably think about it, and how we might in fact go about reforming it. I want to say that from my own perspective, this does set out a new agenda. In trying to characterize this agenda, this is the first topic, a new agenda, I see a parallel with my earlier work on literacy. When I began working on literacy about 30 years ago or so, I realized that there was a whole field of literacy before I entered it. The reason I entered it was because I didn't want to just join the field, which I saw primarily as devoted to the advance of literacy. UNESCO had come out with strong proposals for making everyone in the world literate. Schools were desperately keen on teaching everybody to read better. And I didn't want to join that exercise of improving and extending literacy. I wanted to try to answer the question, what is literacy? What's the fuss about? Why in the world would people be putting so much effort into literacy? And is the effort legitimate? So I tried to change, I saw my work in literacy as changing the focus from how to improve things to how to understand things, really. And I see the same with my work on schooling and on reform in schooling. I've written this book on psychological theory and educational reform. It actually exists. This is Newton's copy, not my own. So I'm very, very pleased. One person has. When I approached the question of reforming, education reform, I wasn't really interested in the question of how to make schools better. There are hosts of people working on the question of how to reform schooling. Not reform schools, but reforming existing educational schools. And in fact, educational theory, I think, has slavishly been stuck on a too narrow question, namely, how can we improve schooling? Because I think the history shows we don't do very well in trying to improve schooling. The history of education reform is a rather dismal one. And yet we know that schools do need to be altered, improved, and so on. But instead of just adding to the literature on how to improve things, which as I say, is the dominant concern of educational researchers more or less the world over, I wanted to change the question into this sort of general question again, how to understand schooling. What's going on? What are schools? Why do they have the structure that they have? What are the principles underlying the creation of schooling? Why are schools so resistant to change? Those kinds of issues. So my attempt really is to reframe the question of educational reform. There are many people, even eminent people in OISE, who are quite known for their successful work in improving aspects of education. I'm not trying to improve schooling. I'm trying to understand schooling. The main concept that I'll introduce is this concept of institutional isomorphism. It's a kind of a technical term, and most of you may not have come upon it, although if you're in sociology, you probably have. Psychologists certainly haven't. And the idea of institutional isomorphism explains something about the difficulties of improving and changing schooling. It's that once you create a bureaucratic structure with responsibility for raising children, and once the goals of that enterprise become fairly clear, the degrees of freedom for operating within that are extremely limited. So that people might say, well, we must have a new teaching style or something of this sort. Well, you know, you can do a little bit with the teaching style. Or let's have a new way of assessing and classifying students. Well, you can do a little bit in that. But as long as you're stuck within a broad, bureaucratic, institutional structure that specifies already issues of responsibility, accountability, standards, goals, criteria, things like that, that pretty well fixes the operation. And once you add to that the levels of accountability and responsibility, who's responsible for what, it settles into a pretty stable institutional structure that's quite resistant to change. So for my purposes, it becomes, that's the second point now, important to distinguish a number of things which are often conflated. Our department in psychology here is the Department of Human Development. It used to be the Department of Educational Development, Educational Psychology. How did it become Human Development? Well, because nobody saw any difference between the two things. Education is an aspect of human development, so why not have human development? And I think it's important, counter to my own professional allegiances, to distinguish development, education, and schooling. The whole society has an interest in education and has responsibilities for education, certainly including parents and so on. And I want to say that the schools have a peculiar responsibility. And it's just a mistake to conflate those things, to think that development, education generally, and schooling are sort of the same thing. Because schools, I want to say, are very peculiar institutions with a rather focused mandate and a particular set of responsibilities and accountabilities. And I think that a theory of schooling will be improved by delineating what those responsibilities are. In Canada at the moment, it seems to me that any social problem is just thrown to education, and education is supposed to deal with it. It can be anything: poverty, racism, violence, inequities of various sorts, everything, crime. If the society doesn't know what else to do with it, it just gives it to the school. The school sort of fumbles around with it, of course makes a mishmash of it, and then is considered a failure. Whereas if the school took more seriously what its specific accountabilities and responsibilities were, then they could be addressed, leaving others to take on their own responsibilities. So I just had found a sort of cliche for this. All the world's a school. We might be tempted to say yes, and I want to say no, don't say that. Because when you do, you are taking on more than you can grant. This program is actually a lifelong learning or learning and work kind of program, and of course that's an admirable and an important kind of work, but that shouldn't be seen as just an instance of schooling. Schooling is a narrow, institutional, mandated set of goals with sets of responsibilities and accountability for achieving it. The third point, I wanted to say theory of schooling is not a theory of pedagogy. Issues like child-centered versus teacher-centered are of great importance and have to be dealt with on an ongoing sort of basis, but that's not the issue in educational research. It's not to figure out is one slightly better than the other or so on. The choice of means remains somewhat optional to the people who are employing them once the criteria and standards for judgment are in place. I wanted to say something on knowledge and power, but I won't. The central key in thinking about schooling in the way that I'm proposing is to think of it in terms of responsibility and accountability. Who's responsible for what? Because the responsibility occurs at several levels of an institutional structure. You know, the state has responsibilities, but so do boards of education, so do principals of schools, so do teachers. And the thing that I noted in particular when I was working on my book was that nobody said that the students have any responsibility. Students are absolutely missing in models of educational reform and educational change. They're not even there. Responsibility ends at the teacher. Well, how can you even approach a coherent theory of schooling if you don't try to sort out levels of responsibility throughout the system? Students have responsibilities, teachers also have responsibilities, and it's important to say who's responsible for what, and how would you know that they've met their responsibilities, because that's how you track accountability. And once you see responsibility as the key to the understanding of the educational structure, then you can't escape the issue of intentionality, which is also missing from psychological theory. So my own field is really blind to issues of intentionality. Consequently, they have no theories of responsibility. Consequently, they don't have much of a theory of schooling either. And actually, point 5 just summarizes what I've said about, except for this business about schooling being a documentary process, which I won't comment on here, but another way of characterizing schooling. So I said I'd talk for 10 minutes. That's 10 minutes.
My goodness. I've never had someone keep to in any of our sessions here in our department. Thank you very much. Yeah, we can have my feet going here for sure. Newton, do you want me to get something going around?
Okay.
Yeah. Oh, this is just for viewing now.
Oh, sorry.
It's not a- just everyone's just-
I'm very glad to be here. I'm very glad to have this opportunity to share ideas and to have the beginning of our dialogue. And I will start presenting just some ideas about what I think could be a Marxist theory of schooling. I prepared some transparencies in order to make easier to understand, because my pronunciation is not very good.
Maybe come even further this way
Maybe.
so they can see the screen. That's good.
Within the context of schools, what would be the approach of a Marxist pedagogy consist of? A Brazilian educator responded to this question by emphasizing that such an approach would identify the most developed forms through which objective and historically produced knowledge is expressed, recognizing the conditions of its production, while understanding its principal manifestations as well as the present tendencies of its transformation. Convert objective knowledge into school knowledge in such a way as to make its appropriation by students possible within school space and time. Provide the means necessary for the student to, as a result, not only appropriate objective knowledge, but to also appropriate the process of its production and the tendencies of its transformation. I agree with this answer formulated by Dermeval Saviani, emeritus professor of Unicamp, Universidade Estadual de Campinas, who since the 70s has become an important reference in both Brazil and the rest of South America for educators who have been working for the construction of a Marxist pedagogy. Saviani also formulated the following definition of the educational work of schools. Educational work is aimed to produce intentionally and directly in each individual the humanity that has been produced historically and collectively by humankind. In this sense, the objective of education is related, on one hand, to the identification of the cultural content that needs to be appropriated by the individual in the process of formation or humanization, and on the other hand, and at the same time, to the discovery of the most adequate forms to achieve this goal. The fundamental concepts within activity theory allow us to appreciate the dialectical function of schooling as it reproduces historical accumulated human experience. The three most important references for activity theory in psychology are Vygotsky, Luria, and Leontiev. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels define labor as a vital activity specific to humans involving the metabolism between the human being and nature. The survival of humankind would be impossible without that active relationship between the human being and nature. The social process fundamentally consists of the production of the means for satisfying human necessities. Such production constitutes the transformation of nature. Other animal species survive through an active adaptation to their natural environments. Humans transform their environments to create the social, cultural, historical world, creating the human world. This process of production and reproduction of the material and non-material cultural reality is historical. A cultural object is a product of human activity, even when human beings make any, even minor, change, adjustment to the form of a natural object in order to use it towards some practical purpose. In its most simple manifestations, labor is merely the modification to the physical form of a natural object, a stone, a bone, etc., to create a tool. A tool is a human creation. It is not just the result of a natural process. Even when a human being creates a new function, social function, for a natural object, this process transforms the object in something social, cultural, something humanized. Truth, human social history, the totality of human activity has consisted of creating various kinds of material and non-material systems or structures of cultural objects. These represent the essential powers of humankind. In Marx terms, social organs, the inorganic body of humankind. How are these essential powers of humankind transmitted to each human individual? The answer is truth, the appropriation of the accumulated, embodied, and objectified social experience, truth, material and non-material cultural objects. The individual's formation process is a result of appropriation of the inorganic body of humankind. The totality of social, objectified, embodied, accumulated human powers is a synthesis of the human social and historical experience. Each cultural object is in itself condensed human activity. The historical activity is embodied in the object. A human individual can insert that object in his/her own activity only if he/she appropriates the activity embodied in it, mainly the correct use of that cultural object, but sometimes also its production activity. The process of appropriation is valid for all kinds of cultural objects, material and non-material. Leontiev describes the three most important characteristics of the appropriation of cultural by the individual. It's an active process, it's a process of reproduction, and it is a mediated process. It is an active process. The individual must perform a practical and/or cognitive activity that has to be suited to the social meaning of the cultural object. In other words, the individual has to reproduce the social activity accumulated in the social function of that object. Of course, the level of adequacy of individuals' activity to the social meaning of the object, the cultural object, can be lower or higher, depending on the specific situation and the moment in which the appropriation occurs. The most common form of appropriation is the process that occurs as an spiral in which the individual passes through different levels of mastering of the cultural object. This is one of the reasons that time and repetition in educational process are of such high importance. B. It is a process of reproduction. The process of appropriation must reproduce in the individual the human powers historically produced. Here, it's necessary to point out the positive sense in which Leontiev uses the term reproduction. In current-day educational theory, it is common to see reproduction considered as an essentially negative process. But when describing an educational process as being reproductive and evaluating its process as something negative or positive, we should endeavor to understand what it's that is actually being reproduced. The reproduction of human culture is an essential process without which human life could not continue. The educative process has to be reproductive. The fact that we valorize an educative process by which autonomy and creativity are developed does not mean that we are against any kind of reproductive educational process. For example, we can consider that a specific language is being reproduced when a child is learning that language, is learning a language. Appropriation is a mediated process. The process of appropriation of the meaning of the cultural object is not one of solitary discovery. The individual learns this meaning in interaction with people. This means that appropriation is an educative process that can be direct or indirect, intentional or unintentional, practical or theoretical. Schooling is a specific form of appropriation of knowledge by the individual. Since the later 80s, I have been developing a theory of schooling that combines activity theory and the theory of everyday life, elaborated by a Hungarian Marxist philosopher, Agnes Heller, in the late 60s. From this perspective, I have been defining schooling as the mediation between the production and reproduction of culture in everyday activities and the production and reproduction of culture in non-everyday activities, such as science, art, and philosophy. It is from this point of view that I will debate today with Professor David Olson.
Well, okay, so lightning has struck twice. On time, both speakers. Antonella, could you leave that last slide up? I don't know if there's too much of a hum over there no? Just in case, because I think it may be not to anticipate the discussion, but maybe a point of departure in terms of some overlap for debate.
Here, sorry, do you want me to get something to write down some points on? A little board over here?
Sure, yeah, especially by the time we
Yeah,
go to the
okay.
floor. That might be useful, maybe not. So I want to pass it over to David Olson for any comments he has on Newton's presentation, perhaps also taking time to elaborate on any points of his own.
I'm very sympathetic to the line of argument in two particular ways. The notion of appropriation and reproduction, I think, are entirely valid because, and important, because in North American educational psychology, particularly in the child-centered movement, the notion that there was some standard or norm that the children are supposed to approach sort of got lost. It came to be believed, at least implicit, if not actually believed, that development is kind of a natural, spontaneous process. This is particularly encouraged by Piaget. That you didn't really need to do anything about it. If children interact with each other, they're going to come up with the highest levels of the culture anyway, and all you had to do was sort of supervise the interactions, provide resources and encouragement was one of the ways this was put. Provide resources and encouragement, and children are going to come along to these standards. And what you're emphasizing is that, or one thing I see you as emphasizing, is that there is a cultural norm here. There are high levels of competence in these cultural norms, high standards. Now, in my own writing, I talk about these as the norms. norms and standards that are used for evaluating for accountability. How can you say that a child knows how to do math only by saying that these are the sorts of things they can do? They can do the sorts of things that the experts in the field would be ultimately expected to be able to do. So I see the emphasis on the highest levels of the culture enforcing or directing the process of what you call appropriation and reproduction of the culture. But I describe that in terms of norms and standards of accountability. The part of the story that I would emphasize that I think you've neglected, even if you work with Marxist theory, which is very much a social theory, is that I want to say that the theory of schooling has to be more or less special, because the school as an institution is special. Where I think John Dewey went wrong, although no one in America can criticize Dewey. Dewey is the icon of perfection especially in North American discourse. So I'm not really criticizing Dewey, but the part of Dewey that's undeveloped, let's say, is the recognition that the school is an institution. It has responsibilities that are given to it usually by the state, sometimes historically by the church or some other institution. And that the school as an institution is peculiar in its own right. You can't make a theory that does justice to schooling by talking about Marx's theory generally. Marx's theory can be the overall frame, but the theory of schooling has to take into account this institution of schooling. The fact that there are delegated powers from government to boards to principals to teachers to children, and those are special, those are peculiar. And you can only talk about issues like appropriation and reproduction, or norms and standards, as I would say, if you understand already about who has responsibility for seeing that these are met. And pedagogy, from my point of view, would be empowering the children so they can judge that they've met these norms and standards. That's how I would see schooling. But that's the way that I would achieve what you call appropriation. The child learns not only the content of a subject, but learns how to judge that they've met the standard. They can tell that they can do, that this is a good essay, or that this is a valid argument, or that this is a satisfactory solution to a problem. So those are the 2 points that I would begin with. Namely, the norms and standards, as I call them, what you call reproduction and so on. And then the second one about schooling as an institutional practice. Just let me add to that. Dewey was very good at saying that the schools are embedded in a democratic society. This was the central, pivotal idea in Dewey's theory. So but the democratic society has to have ways for evaluating arguments, making judgments, and so on. So children learn to do that in the schools. That's what schools are for, equipping autonomous persons to be members of a democratic society. And that's all very well and good. But he didn't realize, or didn't acknowledge, that there's something between a democratic society and a person, namely school as an institution. There are other institutions as well. You could say the family and the church, whatever else you want. But the school is a distinctive institution with responsibilities and accountability that I think Dewey missed. And I don't see how you have it in your theory yet, although I think it's not impossible.
Yeah, Newton, you can either respond directly to some of the inquiries, or and make some comments of your own about the David's presentation.
Yeah, actually, I have prepared some points to discuss about your book.
Well, that's fine.
I think this is more interesting than my own presentation, is my discussion of the book. Of course, I will answer your questions too. Well, firstly, points that in my interpretation of your book Well, firstly, it was a real pleasure to read your book. I'm sure I'm not the only that bought your book because I couldn't find your book in the library, in the bookstore of University of Toronto. I had to buy your book by internet. And for sure, I'm not the only one. And after read your book, I'm sure that your book is a very important contribution to that really important discussion about theory of schooling. And all points I will make here for our discussion, even my criticism, have the intention just to start that dialogue. Well, first, I agree with you that it's necessary to develop a theory of schooling. It's necessary to explain the specificity of this form of education. School education is intentional, explicit, and systematic. This theory of schooling is not merely an application of psychological or sociological theories. Psychology is important, sociology is important, history is important, but it is necessary to go beyond the idea of education just as a practical application of theories generated in other fields of human science. And I think your book is an important contribution in that direction. Schooling has to work with knowledge as you use with capital, yes, or scientific knowledge. And it is a mistake to make school like everyday learning, as in the home, as in local culture. I agree with you with that idea. And I agree with you too that it is also a mistake to recriminate the bookishness of school education. The initiation of the new generation's truth written culture is one of the most important aspects of schooling. And I think you analyzed that point very well, very good, and this is very important because it's a kind of common sense to criticize, oh, school is bookishness and so, and I really agree with you that that criticism is a mistake. And I have 3 points for discussion, actually three criticisms. The first one is, I think there is a kind of Trojan horse inside your conception on knowledge and on schooling. I will explain it. The second point, I think we have differing interpretations of Vygotsky's psychological theory about the foundations of that theory and about the connections with that theory with other theories. And the third point is, I think we have different evaluations of the child-centered pedagogies. Well, I will try to explain the 3 points most quickly I can. Well, the first point, the Trojan horse inside Olson's conception on knowledge and on schooling. Olson's explanation about the differences between school knowledge, scientific knowledge, and everyday knowledge, personal beliefs, is limited to the formal, normative aspects of knowledge. From my perspective, the difference between every
It's up.
it's here?
It's up there.
Okay. the difference between the difference between everyday knowledge and scientific knowledge is not just formal in my vision. It is substantive. It is related to the passage from the empirical and pragmatic knowledge to the discovery of the essential dynamic of natural and social phenomena. As Marx was written, scientific knowledge is the passage from the chaotic conception of a whole to the comprehension of reality as a rich totality of many determinations and relations, through the mediation of abstraction. I will to understand Olson's conception of scientific knowledge on schooling, it's necessary to analyze his conception on democracy, which is limited to the liberal capitalist idea of democracy. That means the formal democracy, the contractual democracy. It is not by accident that Olson makes analogies between schooling and the legal system. When Olson uses the concept of bureaucratic societies, he is addressing schooling with the aim of teaching people how to participate in a formal democracy. There is a quotation from Olson's book. Contrary to the dream of enlightenment, education does not civilize human beings. So much for the perfectibility of humankind. What has replaced the hopefulness of enlightenment? I suggest it is the view that it is institutions, not persons, that are perfectible. In a sense, this is the old Marxist view, but with an important difference. The Marxists hoped to kill two birds with one stone, namely, perfect the institutions and in that way perfect the individual as well. That is, for the Marxists, the enlightenment goal of the perfection of the individual was to be achieved through social institutional means. The new view abandons the Enlightenment hopes altogether. People are just fine as they are. They do not need to be changed in any basic way. What they need to learn is to participate in the institutions, not just achieve personal goals, but also to contribute to the perfection of those institutions, to make them more effective in achieving their specialized goals. Ideally, they need to learn not only to participate effectively in those institutions, but also to criticize them, to make them more accessible, more just, and more humane. In such an institutional context, it is no more realistic to address questions of personal beliefs independently of the society's knowledge and its institutions than it is to address questions of personal virtue independently of the courts and respect of law. The personal is completely embedded in the institutional. In my interpretation, this is the foundation stone of Olson's theory of schooling. And this is the perspective from which he makes a distinction between institutionalized knowledge and personal beliefs, and defends that school works with knowledge, scientific knowledge, institutionalized knowledge. Does this distinction mean that Olson considers knowledge truer than personal belief? No. The difference is just that knowledge is constituted by institutional beliefs. But why does society need to institutionalize knowledge? Olson's answer is, these institutional structures put constraints on what is taken as known in a society. That is the point. Adopting the separation between the nature of the individual and his participation in social institutions, Olson is forced to adopt an epistemological relativism because in such a perspective there is no substantive criteria for comparing different kinds of knowledge and deciding which one is better, which one is truer. That is the explanation for why Olson has adopted the neo-pragmatic or constructivist, postmodernist, relativist epistemology. Barbara Einstein, Smith, Richard Duarte, Nilsson Goodman, and Jerome Bruner. This is, in my opinion, this relativist and merely formal conception of it is a Trojan horse that you put inadvertently inside your theory of schooling. I have time for the other 2 points.
Well, I'd rather you not, yeah.
Yeah, maybe.
2 things. If you want to, maybe Professor Olson can respond, because there's some very direct questions there that would be interesting, with an eye to the fact that you too can respond to those initial inquiries
okay.
after this. So, Professor Olson.
Okay. Very good point. But I'm not a relativist. I'm an institutionalist. Which is to say that I don't think that at least I don't want to claim that schooling can be based on the real truth. I want to say schooling can be based on what biologists take to be the truth. Even if biologists believe a lot of different, or psychologists, you know, if you get a group of psychologists together, if you get 2 people who agree on anything, it's remarkable. And yet, psychologists as a discipline, as a group with journals and editorial boards and things like that, can say this is legitimate psychological knowledge, this is knowledge. This is my argument against creation science. Biologists can say, is that a legitimate theory in biology? They say, no, to me that's the end of the story. You don't need to say, well, maybe creation science is the real truth. The real truth, that's what makes me, as you say, sort of a constructivist. I don't say real truth. I just say what the discipline says. This is what physicists say. They have the power in a bureaucratic society to say, this is what physics is. You want to be a physicist, you have to know these things, be able to do these things. And then within that you can think what you like pretty well. Whereas so I'm not quite a relativist, but I'm more of a relativist than you are. You seem to think that there is a real truth of the matter, which maybe there is, but I don't try to defend that. So I'm neo-pragmatist. That's a very good point, very good description of me actually. I don't use that term myself, but that would be accurate.
So how do you, there's a direct charge there too. Is there, I've heard a couple lectures by you now, and the question has come up a couple times. What is, you get at, you know, some pretty high ground in terms of epistemological claims about knowledge and truth. I'm sorry, I don't want to jump into the debate. But no, I appreciate response to that because it comes off the tail end here. And then also the original question that was posed by Professor Olson too.
About the question of school as an institution. I have been trying to analyze school as an institution, and I totally agree with you that school has an specificity as an institution. school education isn't at all the same education that family education or everyday learning in social practices. School education is a specific kind of education, and I can say something stronger than that. In my perspective, school education is the most developed form of education. And if we don't understand that most developed form of education, we will have we will find a lot of difficulties to understand the others form of education, because as you know, I adopt that methodological conception that from Marx, that the most developed form is the key to understand the other forms. Well, how I have been trying to understand school education as an institution is analyzing school education as a mediation between everyday life and non-everyday fields of social practices, as science, philosophy, art. So, and I have been trying to analyze school education from that approach. That philosophical approach was developed by Agnes Heller in the later 60s, when she was yet a Marxist philosopher. And I'm trying to understand the characteristics of school activities and the difference and the similarities of that activities and everyday life. What is different in school activities from everyday life? And what is similar, not because school education is trying to contribute really for individuals' formation, but sometimes, or I can say most of times, school education are so close to everyday practice in consequence of the alienation of our society. And the theory, the Marxist theory of alienation is very important for me. And a lot of people who are making interesting research about school, they don't talk about alienation in our society. And a lot of situations we have the reproduction inside the school of the alienation produced for the capitalist society. But you are right when you say, well, we can't just from the general Marxist theory of society and history to I could say in a deductive way to understand what is school education. And Vygotsky had that concerning too, but on psychology. Vygotsky criticized people who try to understand mind just from in a deductive way from the study of Marx's works and so. And he defended the necessity of general theory of mind, or a general psychology, a theory of psychological phenomena. And I understand that you are right, I agree with you. We need to understand more what is school, what is schooling, the specificities of schooling, in order to, I'm trying to do that inside a critical conception about our society. In one, I will not remember, of course, the page, but in some point of your book, you wrote more or less like that. No society learns the young for a different society. I agree with you, but I understand that society, our society, is contradictory. We have contradictions, and we have contradictions inside the school system too. And what I have been trying to do is in a theoretical analysis to understand how, in a Marxist perspective, we can work with that contradictions in order to contribute to transformation of our society. And my point, my most important point is we need to socialize the knowledge. And in order to socialize knowledge, we need to discuss what we understand for knowledge. And that's why I appreciate your discussion about knowledge. I disagree with your neo-pragmatism conception, but I appreciate that you are discussing that as an important point of theory of schooling. And for sure, I disagree with the relativist approach to this.
I'll give a fair warning to the floor, and we're going to open it up to discussion. And just as people are beginning to formulate their questions or commentary, I'll give you a chance to just respond if need be for clarifications.
I think that, I'm not sure that this is the Trojan horse, but it is a fact that my program or agenda or outlook is rather on the favors the reproduction of the existing institutional structures. I mean, I say biologists have the right to say what's biology. I don't have anything in there that can say, here's how you'd overthrow the biologists and get something else in here. Here's how you change the society. As a matter of fact, part of my thinking was that the reason that the child-centered movements of the 60s and so on failed, they didn't totally fail, but they failed to some extent, was that they thought that the school was the institution for changing the society. Dewey thought this. Dewey thought America is, has a great future, but it only has a great future if you use education to reform the society. Well, the people with most money and power don't want to see the society change very much. So Dewey didn't fall on particularly receptive ears. And I think in the 60s, when educators started to say, school is oppressive, you're grinding children into these mass-produced objects identical to each other, what happened to freedom and so on. So they wanted to use the school to change the society again. And I want to say, you need to change the society, but it's not the job of the school. The school's job is much more limited than that. But that creates a problem for me, which you pointed out, that namely, you do want to have school more than just sort of the slavish reproduction of this existing capitalist social order. You want them to know enough that they can actually look for a better way, look for possible ways of rethinking themselves, rethinking knowledge, rethinking society, so that the society can continue to grow and change. And I would say that is a kind of a silence in my book.
Just a point. I have the same conception. I don't think that school can change the society. I totally agree. School can't change the society. In a Marxist perspective, it's wrong to say that school can change the society. What I think is if inside school education we don't socialize the knowledge, we are not contributing to the change of society. School can contribute, not change. But when depends on our epistemology, we think that we are defending the school, but we are not defending school because we are defending a relativistic approach. And for example, theory of evolution, you discussed about that theory of evolution and creation. Sorry, theory of evolution is the truth. Creationism is wrong. If we don't accept that, in my opinion, we could think that we are defending school, but we are not defending knowledge, because knowledge is just a question of taking as truth or shared institutional shared beliefs. And my point is, most of the time it's hard people understand that my point. My point is, our epistemological conceptions have political consequence, ideological consequence. And I agree with you that people thinking that they were changing the society inside the school, they forget what is the task of school. The task of school is teach, is to transmit knowledge.
One more round on creation science. This is fascinating because I agree with you. Evolutionary theory is, quote, true, and creation science is a fake science. But in America, more than Canada maybe, but I share this to some extent, I believe people can believe whatever they like. You know, I mentioned in here, people are entitled in the Declaration of Human Rights and Freedoms to believe the most bizarre, idiosyncratic ideas that they want to. They can, as we say, it's a free country. You can think whatever you like. And I think children too have the right to think whatever they like. But if you want to pass the exam, if you want to be a biologist, if you want to be, you know, in any social role in the society, you have to be able, you have to, as we say, know, I know with a capital K, what's taken as the truth in that distance. See, I use, this is a Dewey expression too. I always say what's taken is true, and you always say what is true. I don't ever say what is true. I only say what is taken as true. So that's what makes me a relativist, a neo-pragmatist, yes. And makes you what? What does that make you?
From an epistemological sense, a Marxist perspective is materialist, dialectical, and historical. But for sure, it's materialist. Or we can understand materialist as the same you call realist.
Well, it solidifies a point of departure here.
Okay.
It really has solidified something to begin discussing. Anyways, I'll open it up to the floor for any commentary or questions. I think certainly after listening to Newton, the phrase "all the world's a school" takes on a new twist in terms of alienation.
Yes.
Yeah, Earl?
I have a question that it has to do with sort of the way you're thinking of schools as institutions, and the way that you're both talking about it. And it may just be the function of this talk and not what you really hold. It sounds like schools have been with us since the dawn of time, and that's certainly not true. All institutions emerge in response to some social context, and presumably, my conjecture is that they are created to promote stability. And to the degree that they do that, they are doing their job. And part of their stability has a reproductive role to it. But with schools, beyond the stability, you also want it in some ways to contribute to the betterment of our life. So if there is change, we want to see it along that way. If that's the case, then, and you take seriously the notion that we are changing our socioeconomic context in such a way that has never really been experienced before. It's quite revolutionary in the way that we're moving more to knowledge-based type of work, and the whole notion that one's productivity is measured by how much knowledge you can create and how well you go about doing that. If that's the case, it's a new socioeconomic reality that demands a complete reform of the schooling system. So you may just be studying Latin now by taking a look at trying to come up with a theory for schools the way they are today. By the time it's actually developed, it's going to be a new institution anyway. So I'm just reacting to that.
Yeah, either. Schools haven't changed much, except, well, there's a chapter in my book called Some Preliminaries to the History of Schooling, which is very much preliminary, but schools changed because of different powerful institutions that got the right to tell people what they should be like. So the church, when the church ran the schools, you know, they could determine what was a pious person or a competent to be a cleric and so on, and could run the schools to achieve those goals. When the nation states took over responsibility for schooling, they had a different conception. They wanted people to contribute to the economic life of the state, to train, make people feel like citizens, so they're ready to defend the country, you know, carry the flag and defend its borders and things like that, pay taxes, and live in an orderly social world. But the schools that were run by the church weren't much different than the schools that were run by the state, because all schools, we should discuss this further because, you know, this is kind of an open question, but all schools are created by the virtue of having a set of criteria which you're trying to obtain, criteria for assessment that you've attained it, and then invention of an abundance of means for trying to achieve that. And you know, it is a new knowledge economy, and maybe the new knowledge economy will be able to stipulate new goals that are somewhat different than those of 100 years ago, but so far there's no indication of that. What's happened with the new economy is that people, some people, huh?
TIMS. Look, our reaction to the TIMS, it's not the national agenda anymore, it's the international agenda or the globalization agenda.
Right, but notice about TIMS, the thing that's important about TIMS is that it shows that schools around the world, you know, in 64 countries, are almost the same. I mean, one country gets 2 points higher on the scale or something. People make a big hoopla about it. It means absolutely nothing, except that schooling around the world is absolutely monolithic now. So you can actually give the same test to somebody in Polynesia and somebody in Siberia and somebody in Moose Jaw and Owen Sound, and yeah, they're all, the sixth graders, they're the same as a sixth grader anywhere else. So it's not as if the new technologies or the new society has changed anything. It just shows that these schools that have come up everywhere are all the same. All the same.
But it's not under national control either. It's not in the churches now, it's not in the nations, it's under a globalization influence which will lead to a change.
Well, maybe, but you still have to say who's paying for these schools. You know, the UN can say things like literacy is a universal human right. And to the extent that they can pay for this, they can actually see that this means something. But they can't pay for much of it, and so it doesn't mean much. Nation states, not all, we heard a session about the other day, National Treasury has no money, and yet they say everyone's supposed to be educated. But in Western societies at least, people who pay for the education and that pay for defense and so on are still nation states, and those things haven't changed a whit.
Yeah,
Anyway, it's an open question actually, whether things have changed.
Firstly, I disagree that we are in a kind of new society, a knowledge society. In my opinion, this is much more ideology than real changing in our society. We are living, our society is essentially a capitalist society. We are not in a knowledge society, we are in a capitalist society. What is changing is how the capital appropriates the knowledge from work, the knowledge produced by working class. And school systems are have been reforming during the last 10 or 20 years around all the world by the strong influence of World Bank and UNESCO too. World Bank and UNESCO, they work pretty much together. And those changes in school education are not, in my opinion, they have not the direction to really improve schooling, to really promote a better and more learning inside schools and in all the social practices. In my interpretation, those reforms are just adapting school systems to the neoliberal agenda. And to adapt the school system to the neoliberal agenda is important for at least 2 points. The first one is all this strong campaign against the state, against everything what is public. This strong campaign for privatization, and what they call a strong campaign to I don't know if it's a word in English word, sanitarize.
Centralized, yes. Is that it?
Sanitarize.
Or sanitarize.
The
cleanup.
financial, the state, and make more like companies and so. And the pedagogies adopted by those reforms, influenced by World Bank and UNESCO, those pedagogies I have called learning to learn pedagogies, or pedagogies of the learn to learn. And those pedagogies, in my opinion, are making school education not better, not more dynamic. No, they are making schooling more and more empty, without knowledge. Just learn to learn, just activities, just method, but not knowledge. Because people think, oh, we are in a knowledge society, everyone can learn from computers, internet, TV, and so and so. Then the most important is just learn to learn. And that is a big Trojan horse inside the school.
Just a short one.
I agree with everything that you're saying, but I also think that it doesn't address the issue that when you're in Canada, you feel rather strongly. I mean, we've watched our society in the last 25, 30 years move from brawn to brain, and all the numbers bear that out. It really is now that we live by what we survive by our wits and not our brawn, and that is an aspect of technology that has permeated throughout our culture. So we do have, there is an effect there that we also have to attend to. But on the learning to learn, I think that's why I'd also endorse knowledge building as more of a theory that you've got to move to if you want to take this agenda seriously.
Another question in the back.
Yeah. I'm trying to think through this idea of seeing a body of knowledge as truth and how you work with that. I mean, if you had to take a body of knowledge as truth, it raises a question about how we create and contest this truth. And I'm wondering, given some of the politics and the desires that shape what we constitute as knowledge, whether we can really talk of the body of knowledge as truth.
I'm afraid I didn't understand your question.
Now, you know how you talk about we can take a body of knowledge as truth,
Truth. Okay.
right, and work with that. And my question is, if you also accept, or maybe you disagree, but if you do accept that knowledge itself is constructed, there's the creation and the contestation that comes with that. How then do we work with the politics and the desires that shape what constitutes the truth?
So the contestation of knowledge claims, what is the truth?
Well, truth is historical, of course. Is produced by human beings, by social activities, by activities inside a historical process, and it's most of the time the postmodernist criticisms to realist approach or materialist approach in a epistemological way is they say, oh, those realists, they believe in an absolute truth. Well, I had never read in, for example, Marx or Engels or other non-Marxist but realist philosophers. I had never read that the truth is absolute. No one is the end. I'm not defending that there is an absolute and final truth. Truth is historical, I know, but the fact that truth is historical does not mean that we cannot know the social or the natural reality. For sure, today, again, theory of evolution. Today, we have more knowledge about the evolution than Charles Darwin had. Today, we have more accumulated knowledge about that. But in that knowledge, in my conception, is a kind of truth. But it's the final truth? No. It's absolute truth? No. Science is not science is connected with the ideological struggles, for sure. And I understand that the working class is in favor of the truth. The working class need to work with the truth, and the ruling class need to hide the truth. There are ideological struggle, for sure, a lot of ideological struggles. We can make a lot of mistake thinking that we are defending truth, of course, but it's the reality. The problem is when we abdicate to of the task, the goal to find, to construct the truth. I agree that truth is a construction, but not just a convention. That is a very important point, because people think that, well, if it's a construction, it's just something conventional, and that's why for some people some idea is truth, for other people, other different idea is truth, and we don't have any criteria to compare and to analyze and to decide. Well, I think truth, knowledge is a social, historical, ideological construction, and there are, yes, for sure, ideological struggles inside that. But as an educator, when I'm teaching to my students, I'm very explicit to say, well, why this is, in my position, this is truth. This is truth because blah, 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 blah. But of course, I'm not defending that it is a final and absolute truth.
I want to give a chance to jump in if you'd like, and then a response rejoinder. Oh, okay. Any rejoinders? No. Others?
This is going to follow on the same point. So, well, two things then. This could apply to both Newton or David. I don't see the difference between that and neo-pragmatism, which is what I would have understood to be exactly this idea that we take what seems pragmatically the most instrumental knowledge we have, and it's constructed historically. That was one, but the other question was, do you think that there's only then going to be one truth, or can there also be a sort of pluralism in which you could get more than one thing that would be considered equally true by two different groups of people using either different criteria or something like that kind? I guess that.
Let me give Professor Olson a chance to begin,
Okay.
if you'd like.
Yes, historical truths and dialogical truths are pretty similar to what I think of as my neo-pragmatism, in that with one clause which may be acceptable to you, and that is that not everyone is in the equal position to say what is truth. Like I want to say in biology, I want to say that in biology, professional biologists, the institutional structure of biology, if it's a legitimate institution in a society, they have more power to say this is true. And they have the right to say to the school then, you must teach this. Whereas I didn't hear about institutions so much when you talked about who has the right to speak, who has the right to say. But would we agree that that institutions intervene even in issues like what will be, I would say, taken as true, or what you would say is the historical truth? An institution intervenes there. Do you see that, or do you think it's open field?
No, I agree with you that the biologists, the scientists, they have more conditions. They have the right to say, this is scientific, this isn't scientific. This is truth, this isn't truth. And at schools, it's necessary to teach that. But not just because it is a convention of the biologists, not just because it's something shared by the biologists, but because the biologists they have knowledge and means to find the truth. And the difference with neo-pragmatism that you make the question, for me it's very clear, because for example, again about evolution and creationism, and in a neo-pragmatic perspective, if you read Richard Duarte, his important reference for neo-pragmatism, something is shared for a group, is taken as truth, is a vocabulary shared for a group, and that group adopt that, and it's useful, it's good for their practices, it's valuable. Ernst von Glasersfeld, the father of the radical constructivism, he uses the concept of viability of knowledge. For Ernst von Glasersfeld, and for me, the radical constructivism is quite the same that neo-pragmatism, postmodernism, and post-structuralism, all like the same. And for Ernst von Glasersfeld, the knowledge isn't truth, isn't a question about truth. Knowledge is valuable or not valuable. If it's not valuable in the social practice, it isn't a good knowledge. But that doesn't mean that it's a false knowledge, or the other one is truer than that. Just about a question about viability of knowledge. What I'm saying is, no, it isn't just a question about viability. It isn't just a question about a shared vocabulary. It isn't just a question about what we take in as true. Is a question is how much and how we can really know the objective reality, objective social and natural reality. We can know the social and natural reality. And some knowledge are truer than others. And they are not just shared for more people or more important people, or shared for some institutions. I agree with you, institutions are very important. But what I'm trying to say in an epistemological point of view is I disagree with that idea that, well, it's just as you use the plural conception. Oh, that group share some idea, we share other idea. Well, and good for us if our group is larger than more people.
More truthful.
Yes, I disagree with that. It's a question really about if we can or we can't know the reality.
Can I comment?
Yeah, sure.
It goes back to your point that my theory sort of fits political conception of liberal democracy and institutional structures in this society, and the conceptions of knowledge fit that as well. And in fact, the weakness of theories of knowledge in our liberal democracy is that people can do just that. In our department, psychology, when there was a band of people who thought they ought to do something other than what we thought was good science, we didn't eradicate them, although many of us had that as a goal. They just made another department. And that's the way to go. We, in fact, are very weak on having criteria so we can say, no, this isn't good work. People just create another, just the same as in religious groups, the history of Protestantism. You don't like my beliefs? Well, we'll create our own church. You just, and that's the problem with knowledge in our society. Do you think that you can get out of that by taking a slightly broader perspective, as you do?
I'm not trying to say that it's easy to define, to decide what is a better knowledge. What I'm trying to say is that it's something before that. Because if we adopt the epistemological conception that there isn't the possibility to compare knowledge and to decide. Because one thing is, it's difficult to decide. Another different thing is, it's impossible to decide. I'm saying, okay, it's difficult, I know. It's difficult for many reasons: ideological, political, institutional, and so historical, so. But if we agree that knowledge is possible, that
Then you should be able to
it's possible to
compare.
know the reality, then we can go to the next step: how to compare them.
I think that's good.
Okay, in the back.
I had a question related to Brazilian context.